Startups, they can't pay. Most of them fail. Why do lawyers care about them? We'll talk about that today on Builders Live. Hey, I'm Chris Winik. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Technically, the news organization with a community of technologists and entrepreneurs. For 15 years, I've reported on startup and tech ecosystems. And a funny thing has always happened. There tends to always be some smart and savvy startup lawyer in any ecosystem I've ever been a part of who knows what's happening, who's moving, what's growing, and what's not. And I always kind of wondered why, because famously, so many startups don't do well. Some grow, many don't. We're going to look at why startup lawyers are growing part of ecosystems around the country, what the interest is, whether AI will change that at all, and just a broad look at engagement for entrepreneurs on behalf of the legal community. To do that, the best representation of the legal field I know, or at least one of the best, Kimberly Klayman, partner at Ballard Spahr. Kimberly, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Chris. This is, as we talked about earlier, the climax of my career, getting to be on this Builders podcast live with you. Very exciting.
I will warn everyone. Kimberly and I talk a lot of shit, which we're allowed to say here, and is why I sometimes go to her to try to unpack something. But actually, quite genuinely, in any ecosystem I've been a part of, there are always these smart lawyers. You know who you are, who I rely on for perspective, analysis, and understanding. So let's start with some basics here. There's an obvious point. Lawyers seek clients. There's one reason that we are in and around business, but the startup engagement stuff wasn't always true. There were always some niche going back 50 years ago, startup lawyers, but they were rare. It's really been in the last 20 years we've seen a growth in this. But let's start. I'm a startup founder, let's say, and I go I can Google this. I can generate from AI. I can get a template. Why am I going to work with a lawyer anyway? Why are there still lawyers in startup land in this age of maximum information?
So I think the role of the lawyer has changed significantly from 20 or 30 years ago. 20 or 30 years ago, you were going to lawyers to get the contract, the actual piece of paper that you needed to do your deal. Now, and this is how I view myself, and this might just be self-aggrandizement, but I think of us as executioners. We're going to help you get the deal done. We're going to help you get the deal closed. We're going to help you do the thing you want to do operationally. We'll get you over the finish line. So a lot of times you have an entrepreneur, they have a lot of different hats that they're wearing. They're the people person internally for the folks that they've hired. They're building a product, they're testing it with customers, and then they have to get a contract executed. Just getting the contract, the right form pulled, and let's put aside the actual legal work of explaining the various provisions and deciding what's fair and what's appropriate. Let's put the negotiations aside. Let's just get from point A, you need a contract that's the right contract that says the right things, to the very end of the puzzle, which is you and the customer have now executed this contract. I think if you have a great lawyer, you have one that helps you get from point A to point Z with as little friction as possible. And that's the key, right? So that you're not bumping, doing it the hardest possible way amidst all of your other important roles at the company. You have someone really standing beside you to help you execute those important operational pieces of the puzzle.
So that's why the standard line is, hey, even when you don't got a lot of money or when you're at the beginning stages, why startups engaging lawyers makes sense. My interest in this interview is also the opposite. Why law firms have startup practices. Some of this more popularly comes out of the late 90s when an internet boom created money going all over the place, and a whole class of law firms thought they missed out on an opportunity of oh man, we have to figure out practices. But then there's that bubble bursting in the early 2000s, and there was kind of a settling, and a new generation of more sustained startup focused lawyers evolved. Over the last 15 years, we technically have covered many of these folks in many markets. And when you look at an ecosystem anywhere, at least in the country, tends to be a handful of these firms that make this their specialty. They're good and they're smart. But why do they do this? If so many startups we know in all the data are not going to go anywhere, have no darn money, why do lawyers care about startup land at all?
Yeah, so I'll give you the romantic answer, and then I'll also give you the pragmatic answer. The romantic answer is it is so fun to be part of something from the very beginning, right? I mean, as kids, we love playing with blocks. We like to build something from scratch. When you go work at a law firm, you are in part of this, like, what feels like an enormous behemoth of a machine. And getting to do startup work is a outlet, a breath of fresh air, where you're working with someone from the ground up on something brand new. You're helping creatively and innovatively to help people think through their issues. You get to be a little bit on the business side, which is something that I always wanted to do even before I went to law school. So those are all things that are part of a startup practice as a lawyer that's unique and special and very, romantic and, kind of gives you wings. There's a lot of work, though, to be in being a startup lawyer. There's also a lot of work you're doing, I would say, oftentimes off the meter, meaning not getting compensated. So you have to more than love it. There has to be a practical angle to doing a lot of this work, especially when we do it on unique fixed fee or deferred fee arrangements with clients. And the answer to that is there was a period of time where people kind of lived off of the entrepreneurship of the greatest generation. And this is sort of a big historical high level picture of sort of business in America. But I think we cruised for a long time as transactional attorneys on there being a ton of businesses out there that were created in the 40s and the
Interesting.
50s. And, especially M&A lawyers, we spent a long time through the 80s and 90s selling those companies when there weren't second or third generations to take over them. So there were opportunities to do big business combinations. And since then, like a lot of industries have condensed. There isn't that much of a proliferation of businesses. So if you're an M&A attorney looking to do exit events, it's become increasingly important to find those opportunities through other means. Well, where are the new businesses coming from? How do you find new clients? As of 20 years ago, those new businesses are coming from startups. They're getting born within the last couple of years. So we're kind of having this, I've heard the millennial boom in startups be compared to the greatest generation in terms of the sheer volume of businesses that were created, meaning successful businesses that grew and were sold. And I think that's what we're seeing here in parallel, back and forth. So we were able to kind of live off of the meat, I would say, of those businesses formed in the 40s and 50s. M&A attorneys were selling them in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. And I think we're now at a point where we need to replenish the stock. And startups are doing that for attorneys, that is. That's the pragmatic answer for law firms. And that's why you see so many more law firms forming and supporting an emerging company venture capital practice internally, even if that wasn't their bread and butter 20 years ago, because there just needs to be a new stable of company clients that we're working with in order to maintain and make our transactional practices strong.
So that macro arc is really interesting and entirely backed up by lots of data that we technically have reported on a ton. That in 2019, Americans were the least entrepreneurial they had been in 40 years. We had been steadily incorporating fewer and fewer businesses. And then we saw this miraculous pop in the pandemic. Longtime technically readers know this well. We covered this a ton. A credible bonanza of new business incorporations beginning in late 2020. And initially, there was a lot of skepticism among economists of what is happening. Is this all just a giant PPP scam? But it has continued to sustain. Now, something that you and I have talked glancingly on before, Kimberly, that might get me back to if you're talking to maybe a young lawyer or associate at a law firm that does not make a lot of investments around startup engagement, but wants to change that. You hit on a big point of like why a law firm might want to have this practice. But the wrinkle in that is we've seen this big startup boom, entrepreneurship boom in the last 3 years, but it's not the same kind of companies that we're used to. Most incorporated entities have always been non-employer entities. That has always been true. It's kind of the one-person consulting thing, or I have a little LLC just to manage a rental property. That is what most incorporated entities are. But we've seen in this pandemic era a wave of one person or small employee firms that are staying smaller. They're either not raising capital, they're trying to build technology that they hope will keep them small. Sometimes they're still taking on consultants, but these kind of like one and small firms are part of this startup boom. But a lot of the logic in the 2010s of the startup law firm was, we'll engage with a lot of these startups and some of them will grow big, and we're making a bet on the big growth. Do the economics still make sense if we see a generation of post-pandemic startups that never quite grow to the size that we saw in the 2010s of the cheap money era?
So actually, I think the answer is yes. You're going to get different answers depending on what the philosophy is of the law firm and how they're cross-leveraging their different, practice groups. For me, I would say that we are always betting on exits. An exit doesn't need to mean the unicorn exit. Okay. So it is also true that in every given year, I mean, we have an 125 person middle market M&A practice group at Ballard. That means we have 125 people working full-time on middle market transactions. Those are transactions essentially in the kind of right below 100 million up to like $500 million range. And I would say on the lower end of that, that wouldn't be considered a massive exit necessarily if the company was backed by VC funds for years and grew and ballooned into like a $350 million valuation and then sold for like $80 million. That would be a failed exit in the VC world, ECVC world. But if you have a lifestyle company that's 3 people and they form a consulting group in, the biotech space, or they created some kind of a platform that they white label for companies, and they just grow that organically, and then a strategic comes and acquires them for $50 million. I mean, that's a great transaction for a law firm to do. That's something that we would, in a different context where we're not forming the company and sticking with them and supporting them on, kind of smaller operational needs to begin with, that's something we would have to pitch for. And with more and more law firms pitching for those types of transactions, it's really nice to get in on the ground floor. And I think you see that in a lot of industries. It's relationship building, right? So in any professional services industry, we're constantly relationship building. And I think the strategy that, a lot of startup lawyers take is part of relationship building is time, having enough time to build the relationship. So in order to get enough time, even in those lifestyle companies, you got to get in pretty early. You do a little work. It's not necessarily lucrative work, but if that company goes and sells, even if they've never taken a financing, they've never done a financing in the lifestyle of the business, that's still a pretty great transaction to be a part of. It's very happy.
Right. You remind me that there was that brief cultural concept in the pandemic post kind of like Gen AI boom. There was that window of who's going to start the first one-person $1 billion in revenue company, and whether or not that proves true anytime soon. There was like a frame. There was a framing that I felt shifted in startup land from the biggest to the most efficient. And your point here of the exits aligns a law firm well with employees and the founding class. The idea is, go public, grow big, great. Have a strategic acquire, great. Find the right, merged entity to form. Great. I got one last bigger question, but selfishly, I want to make one pivot because, though I think you're someone I go to because you're smart, I am proud to say we end up doing like some work together. You are a proud client of Technically. Can you give me the ever so kind, why do you work with Technically? What does Technically do for you and Ballard Spahr?
So personally, Technically has just been a very consistent companion, I would say, to anyone who's wanted to be or has tried to be or has, been a part of the Philadelphia and then broader East Coast ecosystem of startups in the last 15 years. I mean, I know that because I knew that this was an area I wanted to go into when I was in law school. So I was already sort of aware of who else was thinking that way. And in 2011 to 2013, 2010 to 2013, that's when I was in law school, I went to my career advisement folks and said I wanted to do startup work in Philly. And I was all but told that that would be like career suicide, essentially, because there was like absolutely none of that work for lawyers in Philly, that was all in the West Coast. So if I wanted to do that work, pack my bags and move, anywhere, Colorado or California, ideally. And I was kind of very adamant about staying here, and I was really happy to see that there really was an ecosystem here, because technically was on the scene in the 2013 to 15 time frame, and I was reading articles, and I know others were too, and I knew that there were people around doing this stuff, and it wasn't as marketed, I would say, but I was happy that technically was doing the work to market the quiet success stories of what was happening in Philly, because in some ways that was the funnest time to do this work, because it was, sort of behind the curtains. It was behind the curtains type of stuff. It wasn't as flashy, but it was, we were getting to do the really fun stuff. And if you knew, you knew. And so for me, it was always sort of the publication to be a part of if you were in the know on Philly startup scene stuff.
Cheers. Thanks for that. All right. I'm going to lose you in a second. I got to ask one of the annoying questions. I got to ask the Gen AI thing, because Lawyerland has had a wave of digital, threats. We went in the 90s. We thought about an open web and forum doing the thing. We saw in the early 2000s the first wave of kind of like templated contracts, as you alluded to in the outset. And now we have a Gen AI thing of like, I can give all my data and template out something. You kind of already alluded to this early on in our interview, but like, what's the Gen AI conversation within law firms sound like right now? Threat, partner, companion in its own right. What are you thinking about that?
I don't think of it as a threat, because I think, as I said at the very beginning, I don't view my role as necessarily just generating the contract. If you have a good lawyer, you have someone who's going to play the role you need with whatever counterpart you're dealing with in that moment. So if you need a bad cop by your side, that person's going to be the bad cop. If you need a calm, arbitrator of the situation, that's what they're going to be. If there's no dispute at all, then the lawyer's there to send DocuSigns to everybody and wish everyone congratulations and buy you a drink after the deal is done. You need someone who's willing to play this role for you that's not in the organization and that could harm the organization in some way internally. In other words, if they're not doing their job right, like they're outside. The most wonderful thing about your lawyer relationship is that it's not exclusive. And I love telling that to clients. It seems sort of antithetical to getting them to do everything with me from a legal perspective. But I want you to use the lawyer that is exactly perfect for your company to help it grow. And I would love to be at the helm of the corporate work and help you get to your exit. Like I said, I'm working towards that big exit. But for the growth part of bootstrapping is also finding the most efficient and best person to be the spokesperson in the moments that you need them with third parties. And that's what lawyers do. They're executioners at this point, and they should be as entrepreneurial if they're in the startup space as a CEO or, a co-founder of a company, in my opinion.
Well said. Kimberly Klayman, partner at Ballard Spahr, one-time startup voice. Kimberly, thanks for the time.
Thank you. Good talking to you, Chris. Bye.